Okay, so let's begin. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the eLN webinar, Why It's Time to Rethink eLearning Accessibility, presented by Susi Miller. Susi Miller is an eLearning accessibility consultant and director at
eLN Hub.
And she will be sharing her research and explaining why 2020 is the year that accessibility will finally become impossible for the e-learning industry to ignore. And with that, I shall hand over to Susi.
Lovely. So I'm just going to share my screen now and then just go into presenter mode. Okay, and I will just move this away so it isn't distracting and make a start. So thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon, and as Leonard nicely introduced me, just to say that in this webinar we're going to be focusing on all of the many reasons why, both as individuals and as an industry, we need to start becoming more engaged with digital accessibility. So before we get going, I just want to start by letting you know about the accessibility of this webinar itself. So unfortunately, we don't have the ability to provide live captions at the moment, but the webinar will be recorded, and when we put it online, we'll make sure it has captions and also a transcript. There is an accessible Word version available of the slides, and that has all of the information and links from the presentation. So if you'd like a copy, please email me and I'm more than happy to send that to you. And I'll share my contact details at the end of the webinar. Now, during the webinar itself, I'll make sure that I read out or cover all of the information on each slide, just to make sure that I can include anyone who does have a visual impairment. And finally, just a word about questions. So I'll try and answer 1 or 2 questions at the end of each section. Leonard has kindly agreed to keep an eye on the chat and read them out to me, but if there are any answers which need me to find out anything more, or if we do run out of time, then I'm again more than happy to answer via email. So without further ado, let's move on and look in more detail.
Susie, just a quick note, if you could just push your microphone just a little further down. Yeah, perfect. That's great. Thank you.
Am I heavy breathing?
Just a touch.
Okay, interrupt me again if I do, please, okay. Leonard, that'd be great. Okay, so we'll now look in more detail at what we're actually going to cover this afternoon. So we're going to start with a broad overview of some of the reasons why accessibility is so important, and then look in more detail at who that affects. We'll then have a look at some more practical ways of applying accessibility, particularly to e-learning resources that we'll focus on. And then we'll finish with a broader view, looking at accessibility and just some of the small things that we can all do to improve the accessibility of all of our online resources. So that includes social media posts, documents, web pages, etc. So we won't be using the polling function today. This is partly because we know it's not accessible in the recording of the webinar. So instead, as we'll be going along, I'll just be asking you some questions and asking you to think of your answers. So there's no need to put them in the chat. It's really just, a way of keeping you engaged as we're going along. So the first question I'm going to ask is, why do you actually think accessibility is important? So maybe think of why it was that you've given up your valuable time today to watch this webinar. What is it that makes accessibility important for you? Now, when I ask this question on training, I generally find that people's answers, they kind of divide them into, broadly speaking, 4 main categories. I'll cover those now. And as I'm doing that, I want you just to think, which categories do your reason or your reasons fall into? So we start off by having a look at the ethical case, and then threat of litigation is another one that comes up a lot. Business benefits of accessibility, really important, and then product improvement is another one which features a lot. Now I realise that there is some overlap between them, so it's not an exact science, but I think it's just useful to break them down into these different chunks just so that we can look at each of them in more detail. So we'll start by looking at the ethical case for accessibility. This is the one that generally comes up most often for people. And this is the idea really that accessibility simply is the right thing to do, that it is actually unethical to unnecessarily exclude people by making things inaccessible. Now, in actual fact, there's a very strong argument for this case, which is that it's actually enshrined in international human rights treaty. And you may be aware of it. If not, it is the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, so CRPD. So for each of these information slides, it's a huge amount of information for all of them, but I've just tried to summarize it into 3 points, sort of 3 key takeaways that are useful to know for each of the information slides. So the important thing about CRPD is that it was ratified by the UK in 2009, so it's been around for a long time. It's also been ratified pretty much universally, so by 181 countries to date. And fundamentally what the convention is there for is to enable persons with disabilities to live independently and participate fully in all aspects of life. And interestingly, the convention is extremely clear about access to digital information. In Article 9, it says that access to information, communications, and other services, including electronic services, is a human right. I hope you agree that that's pretty compelling. It's a big compelling start to the reasons why accessibility is important, but actually there are many more. So let's move on now and have a look at some of those. So the next reason is the threat of litigation. Now, this one doesn't necessarily come up most importantly for individuals, but it's pretty near the top of the list usually for businesses. But most people aren't really sure exactly how significant the threat of litigation is. So we'll have a look now in some more detail at some of the legislation it's useful to be aware of. So we'll start by having a quick overview at international web accessibility law. Now, it's difficult to provide an overview of everything because it varies so much from country to country and it changes frequently. But there are lots of useful links in the webinar notes that I spoke to you about earlier if you want to do any more research on that. What it is possible to do is to see some general web accessibility sort of global trends. And we can divide, again, we've got 3 points here. So they are often a supplement to existing anti-discrimination law, which exists. They're often stronger, the legislation is often stronger in the public sector, which is just as you'd expect considering how many essential services are delivered in the public sector. And finally, one thing that is becoming of those, but certainly you can see a movement that is becoming more and more the legal standard for international web accessibility law. So if we focus now on the UK law, this is the UK Equality Act is our version of the Anti-Discrimination Act, and it came into force in 2010. So again, it's been around a long time. So one of the key things to be aware of is that what this law says is that now an organisation cannot wait until a disabled person wants to use its services, but must think in advance about what disabled people with a range of impairments might reasonably need. Now, it's really interesting that a lot of organisations, or I would say most organisations, don't seem to know that they have this anticipatory duty to make reasonable adjustments for people with disabilities. And I think the main reason is that very few organisations have ever been challenged as a result of the Equality Act, partly due to a lack of clarity around what is a reasonable adjustment. And secondly, because any organisations that have been challenged generally settle out of court, meaning that there isn't any UK case law for accessibility. So luckily, new legislation which was passed as a result of the EU directive may soon change that, and we'll look at how now. So the legislation itself is called, a bit of a mouthful, the Public Sector Body's Website and Mobile Applications Accessibility Regulations, PSDAR. This came into force in September 2018. There are lots actually of requirements about when things should be accessible, but the key thing to know is that the deadline for new content, including e-learning, is September 2020 by the latest. Some actually should already be accessible, but that is the latest deadline, so September of this year. Now, it applies to all public sector organisations, including central and local government, higher and further education institutions, the NHS, and also some charities. Now, the really interesting thing about this legislation is that it makes it very specific that the legal requirement for all online content is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. In our case, it's the version is 2.1, the most recent version, and it's the levels A and AA, so that's 50 criteria. And this these regulations also require that you produce an accessibility statement as well. So one of the things that we get asked about most often about PSBAR is if there are any fines involved. Is it like GDPR? And the simple answer is no, there aren't any fines involved. So a lot of people think, well, how is this going to make an impact then? But I think many people do really think that these new regulations will have a significant impact. And one of the reasons is because the first time it clearly sets the bar as to exactly what you need to do to be legally accessible. So in effect, it clears up any confusion about what is a reasonable adjustment that we had before with the Equality Act. So as a colleague of mine, Alistair McNaught, has said, now the legislation categorically states that a failure to meet the accessibility requirement is deemed a failure to make a reasonable adjustment, and that is a game changer. So in my experience, more and more public sector customers are becoming aware of accessibility and are beginning to ask their suppliers to prove that goods and services are legally compliant. Higher education is a particular driving force. For example, the NUS at the moment is working actively on a campaign to make students aware of their rights under the new legislation. Now, I know that's only one example, but I do think the public sector legislation will have a profound impact, particularly on our industry. So hopefully that's given you a good overview of the legislation around accessibility, particularly in the UK. And now let's move on a little bit more positive. Let's move away from the threat and look at some of the more of the benefits of accessibility. So I'm going to start with another question, and that question is, what is the estimated UK spending power of families with at least one disabled person? So that's in the UK. So your answer you could choose. Again, you're just thinking of these in your head. So 220 million, 249 billion, or 8 trillion pounds. And the answer is 24.9 billion pounds. So I hope this gives a good indication of just what a significant market anyone who ignores accessibility is actually missing out on. And the 8 trillion, by the way, it's the global spending power of people with disabilities, although that's actually in dollars, not in pounds. But it's really interesting that while this market was once considered a niche market, it's very much now seen as an emerging market, which brings me on to a great quote from Neil Milliken, who's global head of accessibility at Atos. And he says, great quote this, 1.3 billion people with disabilities is not a niche, it's a demographic megatrend. So I think in this age of social responsibility, more and more companies are recognizing the business benefits of accessibility and inclusive design. So we'll just have a look at a few examples of that now. I'll whiz through these. So we'll start with one of the most recent examples which I found, which is Marks and Spencer's, who recently launched a range of clothes designed for disabled children. Then we have one of the most well-known examples, which is Barclays, and they are actually on a mission to be the most accessible company in the FTSE 100. They're also really clear that their inclusive strategy gives them what they call a concrete competitive advantage in an extremely competitive environment. So next we move on to probably the most well-known example of a tech company who've always embraced accessibility, and the image I have here is from their accessibility homepage, and it shows a very powerful video that they've put together. Unfortunately, we don't have time to watch that now, but it just proves their ethos that technology is most powerful when it empowers people. and I'd really recommend you to watch this video. It's one of the best examples I've seen to explain the social model of disability, and that sees disability simply as a mismatch between the product or the service that's being offered and the needs of the individual. So anyone can have an impairment, but this only becomes a disability if the goods and services they try to use don't accommodate them. So if we think of our industry, to give you an example, if someone who is deaf tries to carry out their online compliance training for the new job they've just started, but finds that none of the videos have captions, it's actually us that has turned their impairment into a disability because we haven't adapted it for their needs. Okay, another great site I'd recommend you to visit is the Valuable 500. So this is a global movement which is actively harnessing the power of business, and it's trying to get disability on the diversity and inclusion agenda of like leading global companies. So it was launched first at the World Economic Forum last year, but it's going from strength to strength. Their goal is to sign up at least 500 companies, and the last time I checked, they'd signed over 400. So these companies are all companies who recognise the business benefits of inclusive design and accessibility. So just in case you're still not convinced, I'll finish with a quote from a recent industry report, which actually said that inclusive design can expand customer reach fourfold and impact the bottom line of organisations. Okay, so we'll move on now to our final reason for accessibility, which is product improvement. And although you could argue that this is also a business benefit, I think it's worth exploring in a bit more depth, because I think we need to focus specifically on our products in the e-learning industry. And something that I find really fascinating is to compare attitudes to accessible products in other industries with still a commonly perceived attitude about accessible e-learning in our own. And in my experience, there's still a widely held myth that accessible e-learning is boring, it's non-interactive, it's non-engaging. I've even heard it's non-sexy. So I don't believe that's the case. And I think personally that finding ways to apply accessibility really has the huge advantage of making people think in a different and usually often a more creative way. So many e-learning professionals that I know genuinely believe that learning about accessibility has improved their skills, it's made them better designers and developers. So coming back to my own experience, on the screen I have an example just of an accessible drag and drop game that I created. So it's very straightforward. It's keyboard and screen reader friendly. It's just using motion paths, and you just to select your options, you click in the box. As soon as you click in the box, then your object will move rather than you having to drag it. So it's not rocket science, but it is just a way of showing you that if you think differently, you can overcome this kind of the stereotyped image that e-learning, accessible e-learning is just boring and not interactive. So as I say, it was an example that I created. What I did was I adapted it from an example shared in my authoring tool community, which I think is just a great demonstration of people working together to look at accessibility. But I think the important thing is that this game was then, it was featured in a project which was then shortlisted for a Learning Technologies Award. So I hope that doesn't sound like I'm bragging. I'm simply trying to prove that accessible learning can be interactive and engaging, and it's really just our mindset that needs to change. So just in case you needed any more convincing, we'll have a quick look at two models of inclusivity which are becoming really important in two industries which I think really intersect with ours. So first of all, we have the tech industry, which embraces inclusive design. So by focusing on the idea that designers are responsible for removing barriers for anyone with impairments, inclusive design promotes the idea that accessibility actually improves the product or service for everyone. And if you're interested in inclusive design, I would recommend you to go to the Microsoft accessibility pages. They have some fantastic resources in their inclusive design toolkit, which I highly recommend. A similar model, which is being increasingly adopted in education, particularly in higher education, is universal design for learning. Now that SMART model recognises the individualistic nature of learners and their need to accommodate such differences in order to produce effective learning experience. So unfortunately, we've only got time to briefly touch on those two models this afternoon, but for me they show a great example of good practice and how we should be learning from other sectors when it comes to accessibility. So now that brings us to the end of this section on the benefits of accessibility. So I don't know if we wanted to have a time for a quick question or two.
There was an interesting question from Michelle, from Michelle Parr, and I'll just read it verbatim. And I think it's a question about the webinars, which I know you and I had quite a lot of discussion about beforehand. To make a question more accessible, shouldn't it also be on the screen or in the chat? Offering learning / information in a multitude of ways.
Yes, so I think the for the chat, it is when we have the webinar live, I'm not sure if this is where the confusion, when the webinar is live, we do have the chat available and people are able to see that. I think when we were talking in our discussions, Leonard, about the recording, it's at that point that you don't have access then to the chat. So I think what we were saying is that we will read them out so that when someone is accessing the recording of the video, they know obviously exactly what we're talking about. You know, we're answering a question. So I don't know if that answers the question. But of course, yes, multiple ways is the best way.
Does anyone else have any other questions? Some interesting recommendations.
Brilliant.
Alina recommended also checking out Amazon Alexa and their accessibility statement.
Brilliant.
And Richard Price also recommended the Seeing AI app.
Yes, I was going to mention that one at the end, but yeah, that's a brilliant one. Really, really good.
So that's it.
Okay, great. So we'll move on then to our next section. So
sorry, just one last one.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'll have to just do one, otherwise I'm slowing down Susie too much. But how can I encourage my content providers to become compliant?
Yeah, that is something that we will, so it's the content provider, as in we're talking about the vendor, the people that are supplying, or are you talking about your authors? I assume it's the content, it's actually the vendors that you're, is that right?
I assume that's what.
Yeah. I think that's something that I'll cover a bit later on. Actually, it's the kind of things that we can all do. I think if we work together as a community to advocate for accessibility, and at the end of the webinar, I will touch on some things that we can all do as a community. I think to start making accessibility, improving the engagement. So I will touch on that as we move on, if that's okay.
Great.
Okay. So coming back to who now, so our second section, we're shifting the focus back to people when we're talking about accessibility. I do think it's really important to remember that accessibility is fundamentally about people. We sometimes get bogged down in legal, in legislation and standards, but we're bringing it firmly back now to people. So in this section, we're going to explore in a bit more detail about who actually benefits from accessibility. And I'm going to start with a quote from an exhibitor that I spoke to at last year's Learning Technologies conference. So when I asked him if he had any public sector clients who would be affected by the public sector regulations, the new regulations, he said, most of our public sector clients are in the transport industry, and you don't get many blind train drivers. Now, this in no way is intended to be a criticism. It's a personal view of disability, possibly underpinned by a lack of awareness. But the reason I'm sharing it with you is because for me, it was a great example of the perception which seems to be so common in our industry, that accessibility affects only a very small minority of our learners. So we're going to explore now whether actually that's the case. And we're going to start with another question. So out of a population of approximately 66 million people in the UK, how many have a disability? So we have 13 million, 16 million, or 20 million. I think you probably all guessed this if you'd read the blurb about why this was important from the eLearning network. So the answer is actually 13 million. Now that is a staggering 20% of the population, or 1 in 5 of your audience. So if that's the case, why is it that we so often hear people say, oh, it doesn't affect me, it doesn't affect us, we don't have anyone with a disability in our department or in our faculty or in our organisation? And I think it actually makes more sense if we think more about hidden disabilities. So another question for you. What percentage of disabilities are actually hidden? 30%, 50%, or 80%? Okay, and the answer to that one is 80%. So again, I think that's quite a staggering proportion. So if we bear in mind that 80% of disabilities are hidden, I think it explains perfectly why so many people just aren't aware of accessibility, or they think it's an issue which doesn't affect them, particularly in the workplace. But this is where so much of our learning is actually targeted. And statistics tell us that there are 3.7 million disabled people in work, which is 11% of the working population. And it's also worth remembering that that percentage is likely to be far higher. And that's due to a couple of reasons. One is the fact that many people don't feel comfortable disclosing their disability at work. And another is that many people have undiagnosed impairments, such as maybe dyslexia or ADHD. A great example of this is Caroline Casey, who is the founder of the Valuable 500 we discussed earlier. Now, Caroline gave a very famous TED talk where she described how she managed to hide the fact that she has ocular albinism and she is actually legally blind, even though she was working as a global management consultant for Accenture. Now, the most interesting thing about her talk is that not that she managed to hide her disability, but the huge emotional toll that this took on her and how it eventually led her to set up the Valuable 500. So the reason for telling you about Caroline's story is so that when we look more into disability, we make sure that we focus on people and rather than just on conditions. So I'll continue that focus now with your next task. I want you to think of someone that you know who has a disability, or to use another term, a permanent impairment. So it could be yourself, it could be someone that you know, like a colleague or work, or it could even be a celebrity. So now I want you to decide which of these 4 categories their impairment would fall under. So we have vision, we have hearing, and we have motor. Now, just stopping quickly on motor, because when we're talking about digital accessibility, it's important to remember we're talking about something that may limit someone using a mouse. So they would have to interact with their computer with the keyboard rather than with a mouse. And then finally, we'll look at cognitive. So what I'd like you to do now, once you've decided which category your example would fall in, is to see if you can think of an example for each of these 4 categories. So for vision, for example, you could have ocular albinism, which was what we mentioned for Caroline. So I have to give you a minute or so to do that. And then we'll have a look at some examples. So starting off with visual impairments, we have blindness, low vision, colour blindness, glaucoma, and albinism. Hearing, we have some examples. Obviously there are many more, but we have deafness, hearing loss, acoustic trauma, auditory processing disorder. Motor, and as I say, we have the icon here of the mouse to remind us that we're talking about people who are not able to use a mouse here. So we have loss or damage of limbs, arthritis, multiple sclerosis, repetitive strain injury, tremors, Parkinson's. And then our final category, cognitive. I imagine many people would probably think of some of the neurodiverse conditions that we have. So we've got dyslexia, ADHD, autism, Asperger's, seizures. Not necessarily everybody would think that a mental health condition like anxiety or bipolar, for example, can also have an effect on our cognitive abilities. So although this exercise is a good start in making us more aware about a whole range of impairments which we need to be aware of, we're also going to explore in more detail how we feel about disability and our own perceptions about disability. So we're going to do that by looking to begin with at a question. So the question is, do you consider yourself to have a disability? Now, if you ask me this question, I would say no, I would tick the no box. But I know that I struggle to read text on screen if the contrast is bad, and I know that I can't read a menu in a restaurant without my reading glasses, or to the absolute mortification of my teenagers, my iPhone torch. I also know that I struggle to hear people speaking if there is too much background noise, and I sometimes also suffer from RSI, in which case I need to use the keyboard rather than a mouse when I'm navigating. But despite that, I would still not tick the yes to the disability box. But I think if we change the question to, do you consider yourself to have an accessibility need? I would certainly say yes. I just want you to think about how you would answer. So you may still say no, which is fine. But how about if we change the question again to, is it possible that you could have an accessibility need? And what we're thinking then is maybe at some point in your life. And again, you may still think no, but let's explore a few ideas which might change your mind. So we're going to start off by having a look at temporary impairments. And these are impairments which could affect any of us at any time. So on this slide, I have an image of someone who has an injured wrist which is bandaged. And this is a good example of a temporary motor impairment. We also have some other examples. So for vision, we could have eye laser surgery. Hearing could just be a heavy cold. And actually, cognitive could be at any point stress or anxiety. And then if we move on to situational or environmental impairments, they generally affect all of us on a day-to-day basis, just depending on our surroundings and our circumstances. So again, I've got an image of someone who has a motor impairment. This time it's because they're working on a laptop, but they're holding a sleeping toddler. And then some other examples. For vision, we could have forgotten reading glasses, my own example. For hearing, having no headphones on public transport. And a really common one for e-learning is trying to work in a noisy and distracting working environment. So if you've ever been in a situation where you've been having to write a report or do some e-learning and you're working in a busy open plan environment, that's a really good example of a situational impairment. So I think if we consider temporary and situational impairments, it almost makes it impossible for anyone to deny that at any point, at some point in their life, they will have an accessibility need. But if you're still not convinced, there is one last very compelling argument to make. And I'll just give you a minute to think what that could be. So what reason is it that all of us in the future could be having, could have some impairment? So the answer is the ageing population. So as this UN report says, population ageing is poised to become one of the most significant social transformations of the 21st century. And again, another question for us to focus this time on the UK. At the moment, there are currently 11.8 million people over 65, but how many will there be in 2066? Okay, and the answer is 20.4 million people. So I think population ageing is particularly significant for workplace learning, and that's because 1 in 4 people acquire a disability while they're actually in work. And at the moment, in the UK, 31% of the workforce are already over 50. Now, although I promise I'm not trying to depress you this afternoon, for me, nobody really has summed up the impact of ageing better than a colleague of mine who I used to work with at the University of Southampton. He said, everybody can think of themselves as only temporarily not having a disability because at some point in their life, as they get older, they will. Okay, so we will come back now to that question. Is it possible that you could have an accessibility need? Now, I hope that by now you've all agreed that you can all agree that at some point in your life we all have an accessibility lead. And I just love this idea that designing inclusively is designing for our future selves. And I think then accessibility stops becoming an us versus them issue, and it becomes instead just an us issue, something that affects everybody. And while that's really important to recognise for ourselves, I think it's even more important to recognise that that's true for all of our learners. So actually making accessible learning, making our e-learning accessible does benefit all of our learners. Okay, that's another point to finish and see if there are any more questions from Leonard.
Yeah, there was one last question from before that was very interesting from Stevie, which is, what is the best way to make boxes in multiple choice questions accessible to those with physical difficulties who may find it difficult to control a mouse?
Okay, so it really depends on the authoring tool that you're using. So very often, certainly in the one that I'm using, there is an accessible alternative. So there will be, if you check your authoring tool, it should tell you whether that, whether the interaction you're using is accessible. So there should be a version which is keyboard accessible, which means that you can just navigate to each of the boxes using your keyboard, and that would be the most accessible version of that type of interaction.
There was also a nice comment from Dr. Anthony Bazile, one of my fellow countrymen, about, I'm sorry, I can't find the actual quote, but he was noting that in university forms, here we are, on university application forms, students often do not tick the box about having learning disabilities, which makes it harder for the tutor to be aware of their needs.
Yeah.
Oh, and sorry, he also had another question, which was about how you define disability. How is disability defined?
Yeah, so there is a definition of disability which is in the Equality Act, and I can't remember that off the top of my head. I think that the definition in the Equality Act refers specifically to the amount of time a permanent, how long that you would have that disability. That is something that as I say, I'm really sorry, I don't know that off the top of my head. I think it's also a fairly contentious a sort of definition of accessibility, so that's something that I would probably need to feed back on, have a look into more research on that.
And there was a comment / question just saying that I from Joan, I hope to hear more about how to adapt the end products we're making.
Yes, that's great, because that's what we're moving on to now. Okay. So what we'll look at now, exactly as Joan was looking at, so a bit more about the different types of impairment. So we've looked at the different types of impairment, so we now have a good background, but we'll look in more detail now at some of the strategies we can use in our e-learning resources. And before we start, we just need to look in a bit more detail at the WCAG standards, and those are many of us, since many of us are going to be actually having to use to meet those standards because of the public sector body's regulations. So this is just a very quick overview of those guidelines. It's actually a list of all of the 78 2.1 guidelines. For the public sector bodies regulations, we need to meet 50 of them, and those are at level A or AA. So time doesn't really allow us to go into an in-depth analysis of what these mean and the advantages and disadvantages of the guidelines, but I do think it's worth just showing you an example of one if you've never seen one. And so the example I have is 1.3.1, info and relationships. So information structure and relationships conveyed through presentation can be programmatically determined or are available in text. Now, as you can see, unfortunately, the language of WCAG is quite technical, and they're aimed at web developers who code rather than e-learning professionals who are using rapid authoring tools. So they can be quite off-putting, which is a real shame because they're incredibly helpful. Luckily, there are lots of resources available which translate WCAG into more understandable language. In my experience, though, they tend to focus still on web accessibility rather than looking at e-learning, and that's why I decided to set up my own company and a website to help people who are trying to make their e-learning accessible. So we'll look now in a bit more detail about how we actually can apply WCAG to e-learning and other online resources. So we'll start with visual impairments, and a quick pause just to let you think of an example yourself, something that you can do to your e-learning resources to make them more accessible to people with visual impairments. So just to warn you, I will whiz through these quite quickly due to time, but if there are any you don't understand or you want to find out any more information about any of them, looking at some examples, they're all covered on my website. So I'll give you information about that at the end. So the first thing is to ensure that you have high contrast text, visuals and navigation items, that you always add alternative text to any images which add meaning to your content, that you provide descriptive transcripts and audio narration for videos, that you ensure that your user can enlarge the text, and that you use heading and table styles for screen reader users. They're really very important for people to navigate correctly. So these are all dependent really on whether your tool has the capacity to do that, but these are just some of the things that you need to bear in mind for people with visual impairments. Now for hearing impairments, there are slightly less really. We have the fact that you always need to add captions to videos, that you provide transcripts for video and audio resources, that you avoid audio-based instructions. Background audio is very difficult for people who have hearing impairments, and any sudden unexpected sounds in your learning. And finally, you give control, so you allow users to pause the audio or control the volume. Okay, and then moving on to motor impairments. The one that comes up most often is this idea of avoiding mouse interactivity, so making sure that you don't have drag and drops, rollovers, hovers, etc. But just coming back to the example that I gave earlier, is maybe thinking of creative ways that you can get around that. So not immediately thinking, well, if I can't use a drag and drop, then that just means my e-learning isn't going to be accessible. So looking for if there are any alternatives which are accessible in your authoring tool, or actually coming up with accessible, your own accessible versions is a great solution to that. So interesting, using select instead of click in instructions. That's very simple but a very inclusive way. So actually when we talk about clicking, most people, or a lot of people, are actually not clicking on something that they're trying to select in your e-learning. Allowing users enough time to complete tasks is very important. And then again, interestingly, using heading styles correctly to make it easier to navigate. So a lot of people aren't aware that screen reader users are not necessarily people just who are blind or have a visual impairment. Actually, screen readers are used by people who have motor impairments as well, but it just helps them to navigate more easily through their content. And finally, making any interactive objects easy to select as well. So that would be sort of looking at the size, making sure that they're in a consistent place, etc. And also making sure that the contrast is easy to see for everybody, so that they're easy to select. Okay, so for cognitive differences, we are looking at, interestingly, anything that we do to make a resource more accessible for someone with a cognitive difference is equally important for all of the second language learners who access our online content. So, for example, using a clear, consistent and easily navigable design, avoiding activities which have time limit imposed, making your content as readable as possible, ensuring that the user can pause or hide anything which moves for longer than 5 seconds. So that's a key WCAG criteria there. and then using punctuation according to the rules of the language. So that's a really interesting one. Something that people tend to do a lot in e-learning is to use all caps in titles or in sentences. And the issue with that is although it's actually 13 to 18% harder for people to read, because we tend to read, we tend to skim and scan, and so we're looking at the shape of the word. If we change to using all capitals, then actually that makes it more difficult to do that. It actually slows everyone down by 13 to 18%. But it's even harder for someone with dyslexia, for example, to actually read anything that you have in all caps. Okay, so that's a very brief run through. Now, I just want to emphasize that we've covered those. I did say we were going to whiz through them. So if you wanted any more information about any of those, is if you look on the website, there are lots of resources, lots of examples which cover all of give you some more information about everything that we've just looked at there. I think at this point we will move on to the next section, and then if okay with you, Leonard, we'll just have the final questions at the end, because it kind of moves into the next section.
That sounds good.
Okay, so in this final section, what I wanted to do is just to broaden it out. So I think it's obviously really important for us to be aware of how we are going to make our e-learning resources more accessible. But I think the key thing is not to forget that it just doesn't apply to people who are e-learning developers or e-learning designers. I think there are many things that we can all do on a daily basis with all of our online resources, whether that's social media or our online documents or even web pages, that we can do to make everything more accessible. And just by doing that, we do become advocates for e-learning for accessibility in general. But coming back to a question that we had earlier about how can we change the e-learning industry. So one of the things I wanted to start with is something that we can, if we all work together to advocate for accessibility, then hopefully we can begin to change attitudes in our own sector. So I think one of the most important things for all of us to do is to try and encourage more engagement with accessibility in our industry. So this example, this quote that I have here is from an eLearning Guild authoring tool report. And although I think things are beginning to change in our industry, I do think that we still have a way to go. So this report was from last year, and one of the findings was that people were surprised that major vendors have done so little to make their products meet accessibility guidelines. And I think that will only change if we start asking and we start taking action. So we can ask that our vendors to make sure that their tools are accessible. We can ask for more information about how we should be using those tools to meet the new, to meet these WCAG requirements, since this is something that everybody in the public sector is soon going to have to do. While we're about it, we could also ask for accessibility to be featured on the agenda of any Learning Tech conference, or we could make sure that accessibility is a criteria for any major industry awards. I'm sure you can think of many more things that we can do to advocate for accessibility in our industry. But if those steps seem a bit radical, we'll focus in on just the small things that we can all do just to be advocates for accessibility on a daily basis. So just some ideas to leave you with. So you can add alternative text to all of the images you post on social media, websites, or online documents. You can use a simple tool like Clip-O-Matic or Apple Clips to caption all of your videos before you upload them. You can make sure that you edit any automatic captions which are added to your YouTube videos so that they make sense, so that they've got punctuation and they're not, as many people in the deaf community like to call them, craptions. You can also use heading styles in your online documents to make it easier for screen readers to navigate. And one thing that I like to do in all of my documents is actually just have an icon which tells people that the document is accessible. And I think just by doing that, we're beginning to spread the word. People will think, well, what does she mean? Why is this document accessible? So I think that's a good tip that I use. You can also avoid coming back to this idea of using your all capital letters. This is a good example from a website, so you can see how much more difficult it is. I know the design in the middle is, you know, it's for aesthetic reasons, but if you look at the links at the bottom, you can see how difficult they are to read. Another reason they're difficult to read is because they don't actually meet the web content accessibility guidelines for contrast. So using a contrast checker is a really good thing that you can do to make sure that your all of your resources are accessible. And finally, if you're in any doubt at all about how accessibility is at the cutting edge of technology, you can have a look at the Seeing EI was an example that we had. It's there's so many amazing apps which have been developed for people with a whole range of impairments, and the technology that's gone into that, I'm absolutely, you know, that is already being used by us all the time. So I think it's just such a great example to have a look at some of those apps. So since we're nearly out of time, I'm going to draw the webinar to a close just by sharing my very, very favourite accessibility quote from the user experience expert, Steve Krug. So he says, the one argument for accessibility that doesn't get made nearly often enough is how extraordinarily better it makes some people's lives. Now that's so true, but I hope that what we've looked at in this webinar proves that it isn't only some people's lives that we're improving through accessibility, it's actually everyone's, particularly all of our learners. And just to finish his quote, how many opportunities do we have to dramatically improve people's lives just by doing our job a little better? And I think really importantly for us, we have a huge potential in our industry to really make a difference to people's lives. So online learning is, after all, primarily concerned with sharing knowledge and behaviour change. So what a fantastic impact it could have if all e-learning practitioners created and promoted accessible e-learning for everyone. So that's the end of the webinar. Just a few housekeeping things to finish. So as I say, if you're interested in receiving a copy of all of the information and all of the links from the webinar on an accessible version, then feel free to email me and I can forward that to you. Also, just to give you the address of the website, it's www.elahub.net, and that has, as I say, lots of resources to help you if you are just starting out on your accessibility journey, or even if you're just looking for more resources and more examples to help you. And then finally, you'll be delighted to connect or contact, if anyone wants to contact me, my email address is susie@elahub.net. LinkedIn, I am Susi Miller 1, and on Twitter, I am EllaHub1. So I think we will stop there and just have any other questions that you have, Leonard.
I have just to add, Stevie Page found a definition of
brilliant,
disability.
thank you.
Stevie says, a disability under the Equality Act 2010 is a physical or mental impairment that affects a person's ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities.
Brilliant.
The adverse effect must also be substantial and long-term.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful. Thank you.
There was also some remarks / questions about whether accessibility was a criterion in learning technology awards, and some of us are judges for the learning technology awards, and and it isn't. But it certainly should be. I think it's implicit in some of the other criteria, but it should be more explicit.
Certainly for any public sector of those awards, I think, there's no argument that it shouldn't be.
There was a remark from Sophie Martin saying, I use Noisely, but I don't see what is making it accessible, probably because I don't know enough about the subject.
Okay, yeah. So Noisely is an app that can help people who have got cognitive impairments. So it it's not necessarily specifically for someone who has a cognitive impairment, but certainly in my experience at the university I used to work at, it was recommended by our student services department for people who did suffer from maybe cognitive impairments. And what it does is it gives you like a soundscape, and it also gives you some kind of like soothing, it has a soothing background, and it also has, as I say, various different sounds that you can choose. And a lot of people, they find it useful if, for example, they're studying, but for people with cognitive impairments, maybe with ADHD, for example, or people with anxiety, it could really be beneficial to them.
Last comment / question, Claire Pickard says, on social media, I've been told that capitalizing the first letter of each separate word is in a hashtag makes it easier for everyone, but particularly those with assistive technology.
Yeah, that's a really good point as well, actually. Yes, that's great. Thank you for adding that. Yeah, so what that will do is if your hashtag doesn't have any, if you've got various different words in your hashtag and if you don't do a capital letter at the beginning of each word, then a screen reader will just read it as one long sort of gobbledygook word. Whereas if you actually put in a capital letter at the start of every new word, then that allows the screen reader to recognize that word and to read it aloud correctly. So a really good point, thank you.
So with that, in closing, I'll do a quick plug for the eLN. The eLN, if you guys can see my screen, is the eLearning network. We are the go-to community for eLearning, and two upcoming events that you might want to be aware of is if you're going to the Learning Technologies Conference on the 12th and 13th of February, we'll be there talking about the eLN. One of our best services that we offer is mentoring. A lot of people have had some really great experiences because we have such great members who have a lot to share and are real givers. The second thing to mention is that on the 27th of March, we're going to be hosting the Learning Technologies Awards Showcase. This is everyone that had won awards in the last Learning Technologies event, or sorry, 6, I believe, of our gold medal winners will be showing their work, which is a real privilege to be, to see what a gold medal learning technology, finalist does. And Joan notes, the dyslexia website also has info about aligning text to make it easier to read. Leonard is doing a great job in helping us make our website conform with accessibility requirements. And she also notes these are the winners from 2019. With that, I'd like to thank everyone. Some really great questions, some really great interaction today. And thank you especially to Susi Miller. I personally learned a great deal from that.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you, Susi.
Okay, thanks. Okay.